All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a really big one, the world of falsafa. And, that's just the Arabic word for philosophy. But what we're really getting at is how the ancient Greeks, their ideas, their whole intellectual system, how all of that made its way into the Islamic world, how it got translated and absorbed, and really how it all started. You got to ask where the core ideas of falsafa even come from. Like, is it mainly from the Quran, building on the existing Islamic tradition, kind of like this innate wisdom they call hikmah? Or, and this is the big question, did falsafa really take off when they started seriously translating all these Greek philosophical texts?
Oh, that's a huge question. And honestly, scholars are still arguing about it today. Some say Islamic thought was already there and the Greek stuff just gave them new tools to work with. But yeah, most people think that translating all that Greek philosophy, that was the real game changer. That's what kicked off falsafa as we know it.
Okay, so that's a debate for another time. What we're zeroing in on today is the nitty-gritty, the actual Greek stuff that made it into Arabic all the way up to the end of the 10th century. And the really cool thing is, when you trace it like that, you can see how this whole intellectual exchange happened, like step by step. You get to see how those early philosophers writing in Arabic were wrestling with these new ideas from the Greeks, especially in those early days of falsafa. It's not just about information transfer, it's about like a vibrant clash of minds.
Exactly. Yeah, if we focus on when and how these translations popped up, it's like a window into what was going on intellectually. Like, how did people react to these new ideas? How did they debate them? And ultimately, how did they fit them into what they already believed? It was a dynamic process, for sure. Things were really changing and evolving.
And wasn't there this moment, like this sudden burst, where all these new philosophical ideas just flooded in, some real intellectual fireworks?
Totally. It's incredible, actually. Several super important texts basically all showed up at the same time. Can you imagine what it must have been like suddenly having Aristotle's Metaphysics and Decalo in Arabic, and at the same time, you've got works by Alexander of Aphrodisias on cosmology, big chunks of Plotinus books, fourth to sixth of the Enneads, no less, and then Proclus's Elements of Theology. To have all of that at once, that's got to be a turning point for falsafa. It was a huge deal.
So before this all went down, was there already some kind of, I don't know, groundwork laid? Like, were they already familiar with some Greek thought, just in a different language?
That's a great point. You know, this whole translation thing didn't just come out of thin air. For centuries before Islam, Syria was like this melting pot of learning.
Hmm.
And Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle, was slowly but surely making inroads. You could call it a shift, a gradual move from antagonism to assimilation.
So it's not like they were complete strangers to Greek thought. Interesting. So who was driving this early exchange? What kinds of places were nurturing these connections?
Well, you had these key theological schools, especially in places like Edessa and Nisibi. And what's interesting is that in these schools, they weren't just focused on religious texts, they were translating and studying philosophy too. You see translations of some of Aristotle's logic and even Porphyry's Isagoge appearing in Syriac, and this is way back in the 4th and 5th centuries.
And wasn't there one guy in particular who really bridges these two worlds, someone really deep into both the Greek and the Syriac intellectual scenes?
Oh, definitely. Sergius of Retraina, who died in 536, he's a perfect example. He was a doctor, a physician, and get this, he was a student of Ammonius. That's Ammonius of Alexandria, the big Neoplatonist. So Sergius translated tons of stuff into Syriac, not just Galen, the medical guy, but also the Pseudo-Aristotelian De Mundo. Then there's a work by Alexander of Aphrodisias called On the Principles of the All, which, fun fact, we only have in the Syriac translation. He even translated Dionysius, the Pseudo-Areopagite, and Evagrius Ponticus. And on top of all that, he wrote his own stuff about Aristotle's categories and the scope of Aristotle's work. So you can see this clear line, these Neoplatonic ideas flowing through the Syriac tradition.
So this intellectual energy keeps flowing even after the Arab conquest in the 7th century.
Oh, yeah. It continues under the Umayyads, that's the caliphate that came after. And within the Christian communities in Syria, the focus stays pretty much on Aristotle's logic and Porphyry's Isagoge. What's really important to remember is that a lot of these Syrian Christians, they were the ones who really knew this stuff. And they're the ones who played a major role in that later translation wave into Arabic under the early Abbasids.
All right, so we've got this foundation in Syria. Now let's talk about the first steps into Arabic itself. Was there any philosophical translating going on even before the big Abbasid push?
Actually, yeah, there were a few early translations happening in Damascus under the Umayyads. There's a cool example. Salim Abu Ilala, a secretary for Caliph Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, this is in the first half of the 8th century, he's the one who got the ball rolling on translating these pseudo-Aristotelian letters, about how to govern, addressed to Alexander the Great.
And while that might sound a bit, I don't know, niche, it actually had a pretty big impact, right?
Huge impact. These letters, they became the basis for this super influential Mirrors for Princes book, Sir Al-Israr, The Secret of Secrets. In the Latin West, they called it Secretum Secretorum, and it was a big deal for a long time. And it shows how, even early on, people were interested in Greek thought for practical reasons, like how to rule. And just so you know, there was also an early Arabic translation of the pseudo-Aristotelian De Mundo around this time, too.
But it's really with the Abbasids, right, that the translating really takes off.
Absolutely. It's under the Abbasid Caliphate, particularly in those first 2 centuries, that it explodes. They were way more organized, and they put a lot of effort into bringing Greek knowledge into Arabic. It was a whole different level.
So let's talk about those early Abbasid efforts. Who were some of the major players, and what were they focused on translating?
Well, under Caliph al-Mansur, who ruled in the mid-8th century, you have his secretary, Ibn al-Muqafa, or maybe it was his son. There's some debate about that. But anyway, he's the one who's given credit for putting together this collection of texts. It included Porphyry's Isagoge, Aristotle's Categories, De Interpretatione, and Prior Analytics. So basically, it was an early attempt to give people the core texts they needed to get a handle on Aristotle's logic, but in Arabic. Then a bit later, under Caliph al-Mahdi, you have the topics being translated by none other than the Nestorian patriarch Timothy VI. And there's some evidence that suggests that the very first Arabic translation of the rhetoric, which was later edited by Ibn al-Sam, could also date back to the 8th century. We also know about a translation of Aristotle's physics done under Harun al-Rashid by someone named Salam al-Webarash. Sadly, these really early Arabic translations, they're lost. We don't have them anymore.
So we've got these early attempts, these first steps in translating Greek philosophy. But it feels like things really shifted into high gear when this one particular group of thinkers came together.
Yeah, for sure. When Al-Mamun came to power in the early 9th century and during the reigns of his successors, that's when the number of surviving translations really shot up. And this all happened alongside some big changes in Islamic thought, Al-Mamun's new interpretations, and a growing fascination with what we'd call secular sciences among the elite.
And this is where we have to talk about the famous House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah in Arabic. What was it really doing during this massive translation project?
Right. The Beit al-Hikmah, a lot of people think of it as this formal institution, like some kind of official translation center. But if you look closely at the scholarship now, the picture's a bit more complicated. It probably wasn't this rigid academy just for translating. But what is clear is that those early translators, they were definitely connected to the caliphal court close connections. It was more like this vibrant hub, a dynamic space where scholars, often folks tied to the caliph's inner circle, were doing translations and all sorts of other intellectual stuff. So less like a university and more like a think tank or a salon, something like that.
And right at the heart of all of this is a really key figure, often seen as the very first philosopher in the whole Islamic tradition.
Exactly. That's Abu Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi, a true polymath if there ever was one. He's the one everyone considers the first philosopher. And he wasn't just translating, he was a major intellectual force, a driving spirit, the spiritus rector, as they say, behind this whole early translation scene. He was even a tutor, get this, to the son of al-Mutasim, who was Al-Amun's successor. And Al-Kindi dedicated his big philosophical works to these very same caliphs.
Okay, so how can we be so sure this was a defined group, a circle, with Al-Kindi at the center? What's the evidence for this?
Well, there are a few clues. We know, for example, that the very first translation of Aristotle's metaphysics into Arabic, that was done specifically for Al-Kindi, like someone commissioned it for him. Then there's the introduction to the Theology of Aristotle, a really influential book, which, remember, is actually a reworked version of parts of Plotinus's Enneads. So in that introduction, it clearly says that Al-Kindi himself revised and edited the whole thing. But I think the most convincing evidence is the language itself. If you analyze the language of these translations, along with others from the same period, you see these shared words, the same grammatical structures, a similar style overall. It all points to a team effort, a shared intellectual space where they were working together, with Al-Kindi as the central figure.
That's fascinating. Real evidence of a focused group working together. So who else was in this circle, and which Greek thinkers were they bringing into the Arabic world?
The list is actually quite long. This circle tackled Plato, obviously, then Aristotle, Nicomachus of Gerasa, Alexander of Aphrodisias, Plotinus, Proclus, John Philoponus, and even Olympiodorus. What gets really interesting, and maybe a little confusing at first, is this thing called pseudonymity. This is where some texts were attributed to different authors, usually more famous or respected Greek philosophers. Like sometimes they'd say a work by Plotinus was actually by Aristotle. Then you'd see Proclus being credited to both Aristotle and Alexander of Aphrodisias. And even some of John Philoponus's ideas ended up under Alexander's name. It's wild, isn't it?
It's super interesting, but yeah, to talk about potential for mix-ups, to get the wrong author, that could totally change how people understood a text.
Oh, absolutely. It definitely had an impact on how they initially received and interpreted all these new ideas. Let's break it down a bit, look at some specific cases. So with Plato, we know they had an early Arabic translation of the Timaeus. At least it's mentioned in the sources, but sadly it's gone. But it's very likely that parts of the Symposium, the Phaedo, and the Republic were circulating in Arabic back then. Maybe they had fragments, summaries, who knows?
And what about Aristotle? We know about that metaphysics translation done for Al-Kindi that survived. What else?
Right, that translation by Ustath is a major one. On top of that, they also translated Aristotle's prior analytics, Sophistici Elenchi, De Caelo Meteorologica, De Generatione Animalium, De Partibus Animalium, and Parva Naturalia. They may have even translated the De Anima, and there's definitely a paraphrase of it floating around, one with some Neoplatonic ideas mixed in. Ustath also took on books VX of the Nicomachean Ethics. But to be honest, in these early days, I think the Pseudo-Aristotelian works were even more influential. Those were either written by folks in the circle itself, or they were translations that were heavily edited to fit their way of thinking. We've talked about the theology of Aristotle, which is really Plotinus, and the book by Aristotle on the pure good, which is Proclus's work and later known as the Liber de Casus in the Latin world. Then there's the Que Altufaha, also known as the Liber de Pomo, which is a really cool reworking of Plato's Phaedo, where Aristotle steps in for Socrates. And they even had a text on physiognomics. Pretty diverse, right?
Yeah, that's a lot. And it's not just Plato and Aristotle. There are other thinkers in the mix, too.
Yep. From Nicomachus of Gerasa, they translated his Introduction to Arithmetic. So early on, there's already an interest in math. And then there's Alexander of Aphrodisias, a guy named Quasta ibn Luca, who was connected to Al-Kindi's circle. He translated the first book of Alexander's commentary on Aristotle's De Generatione et Correctione. And guess what? We don't even have the original Greek for that one. But there are two really crucial works by Alexander that are completely lost in Greek, but we have them in Arabic. On Providence and on the First Cause, the effect and its movements. It's amazing, really. And we see translations of Alexander's actual questions, his philosophical inquiries. Those are making the rounds too, sometimes mixed in with stuff by Proclus. It shows how intertwined all this translated material was.
And now we get to the Neoplatonists. Their ideas, as you said, were often presented as if they were Aristotle's.
Exactly. Take Plotinus, for example. Big chunks of his Enneads, the Fall Six, they were translated into Arabic around 840 AD. And then someone went and compiled them, transformed them into the theology of Aristotle, and that move, attributing Plotinus to Aristotle, that had a massive impact on how people understood those core Neoplatonic ideas, especially in the Eastern Islamic world. Then you've got Proclus. His Elements of Theology, which is super systematic, gets translated too. And some of the key points in it, they get attributed to, you guessed it, Alexander of Aphrodisias. We even have this text called The Account of What Alexander Has Extracted from Aristotle's book called Theology. It's like they really wanted to link all these Neoplatonic ideas back to Aristotle. And even Proclus's more controversial work, his 18 Arguments on the Eternity of the Cosmos against the Christians, that was translated too.
So even someone like John Philoponus, who actually challenged some of Aristotle's ideas, even his stuff was being translated, even if they sometimes gave credit to the wrong guy.
Right. They translated parts of his commentary on Aristotle's physics, the one where he's pretty critical. And they had bits and pieces of his De Aeternitate Mundi, on the eternity of the world, which argues that the world had a beginning, a creation. But they put it under Alexander of Aphrodisias' name. And there's a commentary on Aristotle's De Generatione et Corruptione by Olympiodorus, which, again, the Greek is lost, but we have it in Arabic. That one was apparently translated by Ustath, one of the main guys in Al-Kindi's circle.
Okay, so after this first wave of translations, what were the big ideas, the big debates that learned Muslims were now grappling with for the first time?
Well, suddenly they're dealing with Plato's demiurge, this divine craftsman figure, and his idea of the soul being immortal. They're encountering Aristotle's focus on observation and his concept of the unmoved mover, the ultimate source of motion in the universe. And they're learning about Alexander of Ephroditus and his views on cosmology and divine providence. But the big ones, I think, were Plotinus and Proclus. Plotinus and his view of reality as this hierarchy flowing from the one through the intellect down to the soul. And Proclus, his detailed system connecting this transcendent one to the whole cosmos. Even John Philoponus, with his argument that the world actually had a beginning, which goes against Aristotle's view of an eternal universe that got thrown into the mix too. And the fact that Proclus was arguing against Christian ideas about creation and that Philoponus was responding to him, well, that showed those early Muslim thinkers that there were different opinions, disagreements within Greek philosophy itself.
So with all these different, sometimes conflicting viewpoints coming in, how did Al-Kindi's circle try to make sense of it all? How did they fit it all together?
Their main strategy was to stress the underlying unity of Greek philosophy as a whole. They tried to show that, deep down, it all agreed with the core Islamic idea of Tawhid, God's absolute oneness. Al-Kindi himself, he was a big fan of that Aristotelian idea that knowledge, it builds up over time through reason and careful thought.
And Al-Kindi's own major work on the first philosophy, that played a key role in this whole synthesis project, didn't it?
Oh, totally. On the first philosophy, Al-Kindi builds this elaborate argument for the absolute unity of the first cause. And he does it drawing heavily on Proclus's metaphysics. He's using philosophy to defend Tawhid against any dualistic or pluralistic ideas. He cleverly brings in concepts from Christian Neoplatonism, especially from John Philoponus, and he even picks specific passages from the Arabic translations of Plotinus and Proclus, which, remember, were often passed off as Aristotle's work. And all of this is to explain how the first cause creates ex nihilo, through ibda, meaning creation from nothing, a true origination.
So he's trying to build this bridge, this philosophical connection between Greek thought and Islamic theology.
Exactly. The scholar Endrus, he put it perfectly, the truth will not contradict the truth. And that core belief, which Al-Kindi was advocating for in the 9th century, that echoes throughout the history of Islamic thought. It's there even centuries later in Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and his strong defense of philosophy as a valid way of knowing.
So Al-Kindi and his circle, they set the stage, they laid the groundwork for falsafa. What happened next in this story of translation and intellectual exchange?
Well, the next big chapter is spearheaded by another group of scholars. This time, it's mostly led by an Nestorian Christian physician and scientist, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who died in 873, and his son, Ishaq ibn Hunayn. They had a whole team of associates, collaborators. And this period is all about making the translations even more complete and precise.
And their work wasn't just on philosophy, right? Hunayn ibn Ishaq is famous for his translations of Galen, the medical writer.
Oh, yeah. While they were translating philosophy, particularly Plato, Aristotle, and Theophrastus, their big contribution was making Galen's huge collection of medical writings available in both Syriac and Arabic, along with other science and medical stuff from folks like Hippocrates. But sticking with philosophy, they also translated important works by Alexander of Ephroditus, Porphyry, and it's likely they did Iamblichus too. And there's Themistius, Proclus, and John Philoponus as well.
So this is when we finally get the complete works of Aristotle in Arabic, right? Now they could really understand his whole system.
Absolutely. Hunayn and his group, they made that happen. As for Plato, Hunayn either revised a translation of the Timaeus or did a whole new one. And he translated the laws too, but sadly those are lost. He also wrote a commentary on the Republic. His son Ishaq is credited with translating one of Plato's dialogues, maybe the Sophist. And there's a commentary with it that might be by Olympiodorus.
What about Aristotle? What did the second wave of translation bring for his works?
Okay, get ready. It's a long list. Hunayn himself is credited with the Arabic translation of the categories. He also translated Decuplitation into Syriac, and then his son Ishaq put it into Arabic. The prior analytics were translated into both Syriac by Hunayn and Ishaq and into Arabic. Ishaq ibn Hunayn translated the posterior analytics into Syriac. The topics, we have that in Arabic thanks to Abu Uthman al-Dimashqi and Ibrahim ibn Abdullah. Now, the rhetoric is a bit tricky. We think Ishaq might have translated it, but the ancient Arabic version we have now probably comes from this time period or a bit earlier. Ishaq also did an important Arabic translation of Aristotle's physics. For De Caelo, Hunayn took an existing translation by Ibn al-Batrik and revised it, made it more accurate and philosophically sound. He also put together a summary of Aristotle's Meteorologica. We've lost the original translations of Degenerazione et Corruzione, the ones by this group. They did it in Syriac and Arabic, but we know they had an impact because it shows up in later discussions. For Aristotle's De Anima, that's On the Soul, Hunayn did a complete Syriac translation, and Ishaq did a few Arabic ones, some complete, some partial. Ishaq also retranslated or revised Aristotle's Metaphysics. He really wanted to get it right, both in terms of accuracy and the philosophical ideas. And he translated the Nicomachean Ethics into Arabic too, and that's not all. This circle also translated a bunch of pseudo-Aristotelian works, like the Problemata Physica, which might be by Hunayn de Lapidibus, On Stones, which is attributed to Hunayn de Plantis, On Plants by Ishaq, and De Virtutibus et Vitis, On Virtues and Vices by Abu Uthman al-Dimashqi. Take a breath, there's more.
Well, that is a truly mind-boggling amount of work. And they weren't just focused on Aristotle. They kept translating other major Greek thinkers, too.
Right. They did Theophrastus, Aristotle's successor. His Metaphysics is attributed to Ishaq ibn Hunayn. Hunayn did a Syriac translation of Nicholas de Maecenas. That's his work on the philosophy of Aristotle, which gives a great overview of Aristotle's thought. He also translated Nicholas's commentary on the De Plantis. And get this, even Galen, the doctor, wrote a summary of Plato's Timaeus, and Hunayn translated that into Syriac. Then one of his students translated it into Arabic. Now, for Alexander of Aphrodisias, Hunayn did a Syriac translation of his commentary on Book Lambda of Aristotle's Metaphysics. Interestingly, we've lost the original Greek for that one, but Averroes quoted from it in his own work, so it's preserved that way. When it comes to Alexander's own writings, Hunayn translated his Questiones the Third, Point 3 into Syriac, and Ishaq probably translated Alexander's De Anima into Arabic. What's really significant is that we have two separate Arabic translations of Alexander's On the Principles of the All, one by Ishaq and one by Abu Uthman al-Dimashqi, and Ishaq's Arabic translation of Alexander's On Intellect is incredibly important for the development of Islamic psychology and epistemology later on. For Porphyry, Abu Uthman al-Dimashqi translated his Isagoge. That was a must-read for anyone to get into Aristotle's logic. We also know about some other translations of Porphyry, like his Introduction to the Categorical Syllogisms by Abu Uthman al-Dimashqi, a commentary on Aristotle's Categories, which was a source for Ibn Suwar, a commentary on Aristotle's Physics, sadly lost in Greek, and a commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics by Ishaq, also lost in Greek. There's also an anonymous translation of a commentary on Pythagoras' Golden Verses, and some people think that might be by Iamblichus. That one could be from this period. Now, Ishaq translated Themistos's paraphrase of Aristotle's De Anima into Arabic, which made it way more accessible. Abu Uthman al-Dimashqi translated Themistius' Letter on Government. Then you've got Nemesius of Emesa and his De Natura Hominis, On the Nature of Man, which talks about philosophical psychology and physiology, and either Ishaq or Hunayn translated that one into Arabic. Ishaq also retranslated Proclus's 18 Arguments on the Eternity of the Cosmos against the Christians. That one shows how they were still engaging with Neoplatonism and how it related to religion. We might even have the translation of John Philoponus's Against Aristotle on the Eternity of the World from this time, a pretty big critique of Aristotle's cosmology. We're not totally sure who did it, though. And lastly, there's Olympidodorus. Hunayn translated his paraphrase of Aristotle's Meteorologica, and Ishaq went back and corrected it, refined it. The Arabic version we have is quite different from the original Greek. I told you it was a long list.
Wow, you weren't kidding. So this second wave, with all of Aristotle's works finally available, that must have been a turning point for Falsafa. What were the immediate impacts, and how did it affect things in the long run?
Having the whole Aristotelian corpus and now understanding the metaphysics as the culmination of his thought, that totally reshaped Islamic philosophy. Thinkers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna, they saw Aristotle as a systematic thinker, his ideas forming a coherent whole. And those translations of Alexander of Aphrodisias, especially on the principles of the all and on intellect, they were super influential in developing their ideas about cosmology and noetics, the philosophy of the intellect. They helped develop this idea of a hierarchy of intellectual substances, each one striving toward Aristotle's unmoved mover, which they often connected to the Neoplatonic idea of the true one. And they thought that this striving, imitating the unmoved mover's perfect causality through this eternal circular movement, that's what explained the order and regularity of nature.
So within this hierarchy, what about the active intellect or agent intellect? What role did that play in human understanding?
That agent intellect, it became a core idea. They saw it as this key player in the hierarchy of intelligences, like a light that shines on the human potential intellect. It allows us to move from just having the capacity to understand to actually grasping those intelligible concepts and forming knowledge. Take Al-Farabi, for example. He wrote this book, Enumeration of the Sciences, where he laid out this whole curriculum for philosophical education. And at the top of it all was metaphysics, the highest science. And that culminated in studying those immaterial beings, the things that aren't bodies and don't exist in bodies, forming this chain of being that leads all the way up to the first, or the one.
So Al-Farabi, he took all these translated works and built his own unique philosophical system, right?
Exactly. He was building on what the Al-Kindi circle had done with their Neoplatonic leanings, but Al-Farabi also changed things up. He argued that the first, or the one, it wasn't beyond being an intellect, like some earlier Neoplatonists said. He tried to harmonize Aristotle's prime mover with the Neoplatonic one, and he separated God, the ultimate first cause, from the agent intellect. He even developed a whole theory of emanation, explaining how existence and intellect flow from the first being, which mainly knows itself. Al-Farabi, his big goal was to clear up what he saw as ambiguities and inconsistencies in Aristotle's metaphysics, and he wanted to create a solid, rational theology that fit with Islamic monotheism.
After that super productive period with Hunayn and his group, did the translations keep going into the 10th century? And if so, what was different?
Oh yeah, they kept going. The third major phase kicks off in the mid-10th century, mainly in Baghdad. It's led by a Nestorian Christian, Abu Bishmata ibn Yunus, who died in 940. He had a whole circle of students, and this period is often linked to the intellectual scene under the Buyids. It's got its own unique flavor, too.
So what made this third phase stand out? Were they translating different types of works, or did their approach to translation and interpretation change?
There's a key difference here. Abu Bishmata, he didn't actually know Greek. He was translating from the Syriac versions of the Greek texts. So that adds another layer of complexity, another potential for subtle shifts in meaning. But what's really interesting is his circle of students, they were a mixed bunch. You've got Al-Farabi, the Muslim philosopher, and Yahya ibn Adi, a Christian theologian and philosopher. That shows you how diverse and vibrant the intellectual world was in Baghdad at that time. A real mix of faiths and ideas.
So what kind of philosophical texts came out of Abu Bishmata's circle?
Okay, let's start with Plato. We have another Arabic translation of the Laws that's attributed to Yahya ibn Adi, so there was still interest in Plato's political philosophy. For Aristotle, Abu Bishmata translated the posterior analytics and the poetics into Arabic, but he was working from Sheikh ibn Hunayn's Syriac translations for those. Now, even though he didn't know Greek, he did translate the Sophistici Elenchi into Syriac directly from Greek this time. And he also did partial Syriac translations of De Caelo, De Generatione, Corruptione, De Sensu et Sensato, and Book Lambda of the Metaphysics, plus Alexander of Aphrodisias' commentary on it. His student, Yahya ibn Adi, translated the topics in Sophistici Elenchi into Arabic, but again, he was using existing Syriac translations. Another student, Abu Mali ibn al-Sam, he's considered the editor of that ancient Arabic translation of Aristotle's rhetoric that we still have today. Then there's Abu Ali ibn Zura, another one of Yahya's students. He might have translated a summary of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics from an Alexandrian source called the Summa Alexandrinorum. And we can't forget Abu Faraj ibn al-Tayyib, who translated some pseudo-Aristotelian works like De Virtutibus et Vitis on virtues and vices and Divisiones, divisions. He might have even translated the Economics.
And they were still working on other Greek philosophers besides just Plato and Aristotle, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. Ibn al-Nadim, he was the scholar who wrote a really important book called Phyrus, like a catalog of books. He mentions that Yahya ibn Adi translated Theophrastus's Metaphysics. Some people think that was a revision of Ishaq's earlier translation, maybe even a completely new one. Abu Ali ibn Zura translated Nicholas of Damascus's Compendium of Aristotle's Philosophy into Arabic from Hunayn's Syriac translation, and he even started translating Nicholas's summary of De Animalibus on animals. Abu Bishr Mata tackled Alexander of Aphrodisias' commentaries on Aristotle De Generatione et Corruptione, Meteorologica, and part of De Caelo. For those, we only have parts of the Arabic, the Greek is gone. He also translated Alexander's On Providence, which Al-Kindi's group already knew about, so it's still a hot topic. Themistius' paraphrase of Aristotle's physics was popular in Abu Bishr Mata's circle. We even have notes on it from a manuscript in Leiden. And his paraphrase of De Caelo was translated by Abu Bishr Mata and later revised by Yahya ibn Adi. And just so you know, we don't have the Greek for that one either. Then we've got Abu Bishr Mata's Arabic translations of Themistius' paraphrases of the posterior analytics, Book Lambda of the Metaphysics, and something related to the topics. All from the Syriac, of course. Yahya ibn Adi knew at least two works by Proclus, the Neoplatonist. There's Danarin de Betetionibus circa Providentium, which means 10 doubt concerning providence, and his Elementario Physica, Elements of Physics. Then Usara,